and welcome back to Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers, the first 700 years of Christianity. We are today going to take a look at the monks. What were all those crazy monks doing out in the desert? Why did they leave the cities? Why did they do weird things like crawl to the top of columns and just live there for years upon years, only coming down to perhaps help somebody else? It's a rather strange story. They were called the Stylites. But what is going on here? Well, a way to look at this is actually to think about our church today. Think about the church as a whole, not just Catholics or Lutherans or Anglicans. The church universal, we would call Orthodox Christianity, whether it's Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. What's wrong with the church in the modern world, especially in the West? What would you say? Perhaps, for example, materialism, right? People are more concerned about owning things. The more stuff they have. They want the suburban dream, right? The family of 4 or 5 with the suburban house and one family dog and the picket fence and what some people associate with, Wisteria Lane or something like that. For some people, that's considered the ultimate goal, even for some Orthodox Christians. And so some people criticize Christians for being materialists. They have to have the latest and greatest iPhone, the latest and greatest whatever. And so materialism is often said as a problem of the church. Another problem that some people might point out is moral laxity. This is the idea that my values in terms of my personal behavior don't really matter because I'm saved anyways. This is an ancient heresy known as antinomianism, which is a fancy word of saying that since Christ came and we are under grace, we can do whatever we want. In fact, the Roman Church accused Lutherans and some of the Reformers of that very thing because of the emphasis on justification by grace. And so since they were emphasizing grace and de-emphasizing works, the Roman Church was basically saying, you guys are basically opening up a door to bad behavior because now you're basically saying their works don't do anything. Well, of course, that wasn't necessarily true, although in some circles it may have been, but it wasn't necessarily true. But you get the idea here, is that moral laxity is a problem. And in some cases, just because they're what is known as Sunday Christians. That's just kind of a funny way of saying they go to church on Sunday, but for the rest of the week, or even the rest of the day on Sunday after they're outside of the church building, they're just acting like the rest of the world. That's known as a Sunday Christian. There are many of those. I'm sure all of you out there know Sunday Christians. I myself know several Sunday Christians and realize that when I criticize these things, that this is also looking in the mirror a little bit, because it's not like I'm perfect as somebody looking at church history here and also at the current church. Of course, I've had struggles with some of these things also. But as a whole, it's something that impacts the church, what we would call just a Sunday cultural Christian. Although, in today's climate, there's been several news stories that have been released saying that there's a rise of the nuns, this phenomena in demographics that people claim no affiliation whatsoever. They're just spiritual. You'll hear a lot of people say that these days, but again, moral laxity and Sunday Christians are one of the reasons people are turned off from the institutional church. And by institutional church, I don't necessarily mean in a particular affiliation as much as I mean churches that actually have pastors and confessions of faith and actually organize themselves and practice church discipline. Another thing that's related to these things would be a lack of commitment. So in other words, not only do you have the Sunday Christian phenomenon, we have the Easter Christmas Christian phenomenon, which is something that's kind of popular and always joked about. It also has to do with their commitment to doing things outside of that church service, whether it be work days at the church, feeding the poor, clothing the naked. It could be just their own personal commitments in terms of volunteering for Sunday school or whatever program that any church may have. There's a lack of commitment to different things. And so that, of course, would create a problem in the church because the church isn't going to function if its members aren't participating actively outside of just sitting in a pew. Ignorance would perhaps be another thing that we could talk about in reference to the church. People just simply don't know the scriptures. They don't know doctrine. They don't know theology. There's this really big issue in the church today. There's a book that was actually recently released, I believe by a Roman Catholic author, called A Nation of Heretics, which basically talks about how people are not catechized properly. They're not instructed. They don't understand how their faith is supposed to work and how it's organized systematically, so they don't know how to respond when somebody attacks an aspect of the faith. And that's also the area of apologetics. People don't know how to be good apologists. Remember, that doesn't mean to say you're sorry, but to defend. People don't know how to defend the faith. And so there is this general ignorance or lack of knowledge that's in the church. Bible knowledge can actually easily be seen in surveys. I think it was in the 1950s. There was a survey, and it was the average Sunday school student, not Sunday school student, the average public school student could raise his hand if you said, "Who is Moses?" And in the 1950s, all but say one or two would have no problem answering who the figure of Moses was in the Old Testament. In the 1980s, the late 1980s, you would have 2 or 3 that would even know who Moses was. So there was a huge shift in about the 50s and 60s, this is in the United States in particular, from a very biblically literate culture. Not everybody believed the scriptures, but they were familiar with them. They at least knew it. There was a common literacy held across the culture, even in a public school, whereas when you get to the 80s and 90s, and even, of course, to the present day, the situation is even worse when it comes to literacy. Now, there's pockets, of course, that are exceptions to the rule, like in the Bible Belt in the South and in private schools, of course. But as a whole, though, the culture is generally biblically illiterate. So that would be one way. And, of course, literacy also would include the councils and the creeds and the proper teachings involving the sacraments and justification and things like that as well. Another criticism that comes at the church is that it's just a glorified social club. It's just a way of feeling a sense of belonging, or it's a way to have coffee and joke with my friends about the football game I'm going to watch later in the day. It's just a social club. Or it's an excuse for the ladies, the old ladies, to get together and gossip and matchmake. That's all it's for. They feel good about themselves during the service, and then after the service they try to organize things for everybody else and try to control people's lives or something. So it's just a social club. You just take your general average person and group the people according to groups like everybody thinks, and church is just a social club. So think about that list. You can see it on your screen that we just kind of that we've established here. Is we have materialism, we have moral laxity, we have ignorance, we have that lack of commitment, we have Sunday Christians, we have a glorified social club, and then finally the last one that you see on there that I wanted to mention because it's particularly a problem in the West, especially in the U.S., is that religion has become privatized, especially in the church. You've all heard it. I don't need organized religion. I just decide everything for myself. It's as if you went through a buffet line and kind of have a smorgasbord of religions, or even just different types of Christianity. Oh, I'm going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, blend it all together, and as long as I have coffee with my Jesus in the morning and read my personal devotions, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I have my own personal religion. Well, that's obviously going to create problems in the church when it comes to discipline, when it comes to bad doctrine and interpreting the scriptures, for example, because most of these people that do this completely ignore the work of the Holy Spirit in the church over hundreds and hundreds of years in interpreting the scriptures, including the councils and creeds that we've mentioned in previous episodes. So it creates a general problem in the church when it's completely privatized. It also disassociates people. Remember, the church is a body. It's actually a living, breathing, organic organism, and when you divorce yourself from the church, you're divorcing yourself from Christ's body. There are many, many people who are divorcing themselves this way because it's all about their own private religion and individualism. That creates enormous problems in the church. So when you add privatization into all these other problems, you can see that the church is not necessarily healthy in many ways. Interestingly enough, you could actually look at that privatized idea or the ignorance idea and say that it's kind of foundational for the rest of them. But I'm not going to take a hard position either way on what becomes before the other one, or which one is the most important. They're all problems, but I'm just putting that out there so you can see that in the current church, these are problems that almost everybody talks about. Now, here's the kick, or the sort of the kicker into our topic here. Because of these things, we should all be monks. We should all be monks. And because the monks, when they went to the desert in Egypt and in Syria or into the hills of Italy or wherever they were geographically, they were leaving because of these very problems. They were leaving because people were materialistic. They were leaving because people were only Sunday Christians. They were leaving because it was just a popular social club or because everybody else was doing it and there was a lack of commitment. And so they were trying to live out a more authentic life. However, it's not quite that simple. There are other factors at play, but I always just kind of introduce things because I want you to see how history is relevant, because a lot of these monastic leaders, these desert fathers, and the other fathers that come after, and mothers, there's a few. We don't have a lot of writings. We do know there's a lot of monastic women, but we don't have a lot of their writings. We have a few. But why did they do these things? Well, if these problems existed then in the Greco-Roman world, and they exist today in our current Western world, perhaps they might have something to say to us as Orthodox Christians. They might actually be able to offer some solutions. And I think one of the things you'll hear, because we are going to read some excerpts from some of these monks and some of these nuns, is that a lot of this is very, very practical. It's not like they're just having these mystical experiences that are very subjective and you really can't understand what they're saying. A lot of it is just practical Christian living, and it's really, really kind of inspiring to see how they're battling through these things and selling out, literally just, and in some cases, selling all they have to live a more authentic Christian life because of what was happening, especially in the cities with the aristocratic classes. So, what are some other factors that are involved when it comes to this? Well, in the ancient Jewish religion, which of course Christianity inherited as through Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? And so in the ancient Jewish religion, God himself established the Nazarites in Numbers 6. So if you look at Numbers 6 in your Bible, you will actually see some prescriptions such as not cutting your hair or abstaining from anything associated with the grape. Not just wine or grape juice, but things like the seeds and the skins. They were not supposed to have anything to do with grapes, which is interesting. We don't have enough time to go into this and how grapes are symbolic or what they have to do with the complete law and the sacrificial system of the Old Testament and the Jewish religion. But the point was they were to abstain from these things, to grow their hair long. They were to be set apart and look the part. Now, of course, they had to behave the part as well, but they had to look the part. And so in Numbers 6, which of course all the ancient church fathers, they were very, very familiar with the scriptures, to their credit, they saw that, and it was just one little bit of information that informed their view of Christian monasticism. Another source of this, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, by at least our today's usage of Old and New, are the appearance and behavior of some of the prophets. So if you look at people like Elijah or Samuel or John the Baptist and what they do, actually John the Baptist being in a sense or a type or the antitype of Elijah in the New Testament. Elijah has come, as Christ says, but they have this really rough appearance. They're out in the desert and they're wearing animal hair. They're eating locusts and honey. They just kind of have this wild, outside of normal society appearance. And they're lauded for it. They're heroes. Elijah, Samuel, and John the Baptist are heroes. In some cases, martyrs even, with John the Baptist, for the faith. And so if the heroes, the people that are looked upon as positive characters in the scriptures, are doing these sort of things, you could see why they would want to emulate that sort of thing. They want to emulate that sort of behavior. Also, in addition to these characters, we have actual instruction coming from the apostles and also from Christ himself when it comes to what would eventually be interpreted as monastic living. For example, the apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 even mentions beating his body into submission because the flesh, his fleshiness, the sinful part of him, was warring against him, and so he was actually beating his body. Look it up. It's kind of an interesting phrase. 1 Corinthians 9:27. The idea, of course, being that it's more important that I bring myself through self-control into subjugation because these sinful desires are getting in the way. So the Apostle Paul is saying this. Paul also talks about how it's better to be single than married. Not that being married is bad, because marriage is definitely an honorable thing, an honorable estate, as you'll hear people say, and that some people are certainly called to be married, but those who are not are able to dedicate themselves to the Christian life, especially missionaries and pastors and leaders. They're able to dedicate themselves in a way that people who are married cannot, because people who are married have to worry about their wife, they have to worry about their kids, they have to worry about all these different peripheral things, but those who are unmarried are more able to just worry about heavenly things, so to speak. So Paul himself, in addition to talking about beating the body and talking about how the spirit and the flesh war against each other, Paul himself also talks about the value of being single and celibate. So you can see that influence when it comes to Christian monasticism. Also, the Lord Jesus Christ himself mentions, for example, those who have become eunuchs for the kingdom. That's found in Matthew 19:12. It is actually said the somewhat borderline figure of Origen took that figure, becoming eunuchs of the kingdom, took that phrase or that figure, that type of speech, and actually took it literally. I'm not going to explain too much there, but Origen took that phrase literally. At least it's said to become a eunuch for the kingdom, and he actually did that to himself. I'll let you fill in the blanks as far as that goes, but it's a rather extreme case of how seriously the early church took what Christ and the apostles said. Christ also mentions that it is better for someone to throw body parts away. Now, of course, this is not necessarily literal, but his idea being that you need to deny these appetites of the flesh, to throw these things away than to perish in hell. This is Christ himself. For example, he talks about if the eye is offending you, pluck it out and cast it away. Deny that passion, deny that lust, deny that fleshly desire, because it is causing you to sin, and it is increasing that separation between you and God. So you need to deny your flesh. You need to somehow cut off those desires, hence plucking out the eye. Right? If your eye offend thee, as it says in the King James. In other words, does it cause you to stumble, or is it causing you problems? You take it, you throw it away. So Christ himself is mentioning these things. Now think about that just from a biblical standpoint. If you see the Nazarites, and if you see Elijah and Samuel and John the Baptist, if you see Paul beating his body, literally is what he says, if you see him talking about being celibate, if you talk about Christ mentioning about eunuchs in the kingdom, and Christ also talking about how people need to just cast these things away and cut them off in order to deny the flesh, you stack all those things together biblically, and you can understand why people are attracted to a certain ascetic lifestyle. And by the way, the word ascetic is kind of a funny word, but asceticism is the idea of self-denial or extreme contemplation. This idea that I'm going to reject sex and food and all the comforts of life for the sake of a higher cause. All these sort of things are bound into the idea of asceticism, which of course is another fancy word for what monks practice. Monks practice asceticism. So you might hear me use those words interchangeably. I might say an ascetic as opposed to just a monk, but often they're the same person. It's just a different side of the equation. Another reason why people wanted to become monks is the idea of living martyrdom. After Constantine legalized Christianity in 319, actually before that even, 313, when Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which really wasn't an edict and may not have been from Milan, but when he and his co-emperor issued this Edict of Milan, Christianity is officially legalized and tolerated. Now later on, what ends up happening is his successor, Theodosius, is actually going to make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Well, as this is happening, there are no more persecutions. Now, there might be something really, really local and sporadic, but for the most part, persecutions are over. That's a big deal, because for 300 years or so, Christians had been persecuted relentlessly by different figures, usually Roman empires and their governors, and even in some cases Jewish authorities, from the moment that Christ ascended into heaven and the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, all the way down till Constantine. There is a general, continuous, now there are some breaks and some size, but a rather continuous persecution. It was just assumed that it was going to happen within the church. And so when that is no longer taking place, when you remove that option as a way of expressing your love for God and living that authentic life, alternatives become more attractive. So in a way, these monks and nuns, and we'll just use the term monastics for both the male and female versions of this, but the early monastics really thought they were being living martyrs. They were living martyrs. There's an ancient, I believe, Celtic text from the Middle Ages that talks about the difference between a red martyrdom, which is that martyrdom of blood, and white martyrdom, which is sort of a living martyrdom where you're a walking witness for the kingdom. And so these guys, because they didn't have access to that martyrdom anymore, are now pushing this. Again, the word I really want you to remember here, and it's a really popular buzzword in certain circles today, so it should be easy for you to remember, but the word that we're looking for here is authenticity. They're trying to live a more authentic Christian life. So that sort of authenticity was key when it came to being a monk. You wanted to live that authentic life and get away from all the distractions and all the temptations that were often offered, usually in some of these great cities. Another wing of this, and you can see there's just a lot of ways that this kind of perfect storm categorizes itself into the early monastic movements. There's also a strong ascetic tradition in the Greco-Roman world. If you remember all the way back to episode 2, we mentioned the Stoic philosophers and the system of Stoicism and the denial of the passions. Since the passions got in the way of true knowledge and wisdom, the goal was to subjugate the flesh so that you could achieve true wisdom and knowledge. Well, that's pretty compatible with some of the phrases that Paul and Jesus were quoting and saying in the New Testament. So it's obviously easy to see why people would take that Stoic idea as a general worldview that they were familiar with and either apply it to the Christian life or it just simply be just one other foundational element to the early monastics. The Platonic and Neoplatonic worldview is also similar, although with a different focus. If you remember Platonic philosophy and Neoplatonic philosophy, the spiritual otherness, that realm, is more perfect and more ideal than this fleshly material world. So my goal is to try to achieve some sort of way of being ideal, and in some cases it might not be until I die. And so the spiritual, as being more real and more ideal, is in contrast to this fleshly body. It's in contradiction to it. So I need to somehow subjugate, there's that fancy word again, meaning that I need to take control. Self-control is key here. I'm the boss of my own body. I need to subject my material body to discipline in order to be more in tune with the more idealistic spiritual realm. Now, some of that isn't necessarily incompatible with Christianity. However, as you may remember from the Gnostic episode, some people took it so far as to say that matter itself was evil, which was a problem because Christ took on matter, and God created the material world. So to say that all matter is evil is going a bridge too far for most Christians. But to say this idea that there is an ideal state, or that our bodies need to be changed, those are certainly compatible ideas with the Christian worldview. So, all of these things, the Jewish background with the scriptures that we mentioned, the scriptural precedent and its admonishments, the Greco-Roman background. We could also mention Jewish communities such as the Essenes, which I mentioned in the first episode of our show. In the first episode, the Essenes were that semi-monastic group that organized themselves in a community outside of Jerusalem to live their Jewish faith out more rigorously. So you could see these roots again with the Nazarites and the Essenes and some other groups that this sort of thing is taking place. So when you add all this together, what you end up with is one of the most important movements in the history of the church. In fact, this Church of Reform, which a lot of your reformers, whether they be Roman Catholic reformers within the church, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, or some of the great reforming popes, they started out as monastics almost every time. Some of the great Reformation founders, such as Martin Luther himself and several others, also at some point in their lives either studied to be monastics or were monastics themselves. Luther, in his case, was a member of the Augustinian order. And so that monastic lifestyle was often a launching point to get people into a more authentic life and to renew the church in many different ways. Now, of course, Protestants and Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox may quibble with each other what renewal means and what direction we need to go with that renewal, but renewal and reform have always been recurring themes in the church because it's still ran by sinful, fallible men, and so we need to clean things up periodically. It's just what kind of cleaning takes place and what needs to happen in that cleaning is what creates some of that contention. So let's talk about, as an example of what the early monastic lifestyle was like, let's talk about St. Anthony of the Desert. You may see him on buildings, you may see his picture in books or on icons or in stained glass windows sometimes, because he is a very, very famous church father. He, and for some people, is the desert father and sort of the prototype for all monks that follow. So who is this St. Anthony of the Desert? He was born and raised in Egypt. Again, Egypt is that big theme here. Most of the monastics are organizing themselves, or at least the early ones, in the Egyptian desert. So he's born and raised in Egypt, and he's given a large inheritance at the age of 18. A lot of you out there probably think that's probably pretty nice, right? I'm 18 years old, I haven't gone to college yet, maybe just graduating high school in a few months, and wow, I all of a sudden have this great, big inheritance. In fact, this inheritance is so large, if he managed his money correctly, he and his sister, who he was supporting at the time because his sister was also orphaned, he could have taken care of both of them on this inheritance and not worked a day of his life. So apparently he was of pretty good means after his parents passed away. However, when he was confronted in church at a reading of Luke 18 about the rich man and Jesus, he is extremely convicted. This is the famous story about how the rich man says, I am going to do these things. I want to follow you, Jesus. And Jesus says, keep these certain commandments. And he says, I've kept all these since I was a boy. So then what Jesus says is, well then sell everything that you have and come follow me. And the rich man walks away, the rich young man, saying, because he's rich and he can't part himself from his possessions. And of course Christ famously says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom, because their attachment to possessions. Materialism again. We live in a very prosperous and high standard of living society. You can see why a passage like Luke 18 would convict a young man who's serious about his faith like Anthony. So what he does then is he sells all he has after reading that passage, convicted by it, that he himself, in a sense, is that rich young man. So he sells all his possessions and puts his sister in the care of the consecrated widows and virgins of the church, and then leaves for the desert. How drastic is that? You know, for people that are looking for authenticity, or for people think that people don't take their faith as seriously as they should, Anthony of the Desert is a good example of somebody who did take his faith seriously. So after he leaves for the desert, he actually encounters several other monks. And this is key, because if you look at his dates, 260 to 350, he's leaving in the late 270s, early 280s, right? Again, these dates aren't absolute, so we can fudge them a little bit, but we'll just say 270s and 280s. He leaves, and he already finds monks there. Think about how early this is. This is pre-Constantine. So some of this stuff actually predates the legalization of Christianity. Some people actually argue that when certain bishops were exiled and they took their pastors with them and they went to places like Libya or Western Egypt, that they also founded these communities, and that's why Anthony and others, such as Paul, there's a Paul that's also considered one of the early founders, ran into other monks while they were there. So he actually does this not necessarily because the desert itself is attractive. It's not like if he would have went to a jungle that it wouldn't have been as good, or if he would have ended up in the plains somewhere. The deserts were attractive because of their solitude. They were quiet. There were no distractions. There was no hustle and bustle of the city to contend with. And so it was the solitude and the separation from all of the hustle and bustle that made them so attractive. And again, he's fulfilling the command that he found in Luke 18. He is often called, because of this move and because we know so much about him, both in his biography by St. Athanasius and also because several letters that he wrote that we still have some possession of, he is called the father of monasticism. And that actually is not a bad title for him. Not necessarily because he's the first, but because he's the one who makes it popular, and he's the one who sends out a sort of discipline of life that would be emulated both east and west. Anthony of the Desert is also famous for his famous temptations. Now, these temptations are usually taken on in the form of spiritual warfare. And so, for example, there's a famous a famous account of where he's walking and he sees a silver coin and he laughs at the devil for trying to tempt him with money. And then later on, he runs into a gold coin and laughs at the devil again, and the coin disappears. There's another account of where he actually encounters the devil himself or a demon, or you'll hear different people talk about it. And the demon itself, impressed by Anthony's sanctity, actually asks Anthony to pray for him. It's kind of an interesting story. And again, a lot of these, have they been embellished? Are they real? Are they moral stories? Again, I have no way of filtering through this one, this one, this one, this one. It seems like, however, via Athanasius and other eyewitnesses, that something was going on. Do we know every single detail like a modern news report or a scientific journal? Probably not. But there was something going on with Anthony as he went into the desert, and these temptations and trials become enormously popular. In fact, these stories would often be shown in the form of Western art. If you look at your screen, you can actually see the temptation of Anthony in a famous drawing by Michelangelo. It's early, it's very early, but there are many others too. And so if you look at your screen, we have the Torment of St. Anthony in 1489, so that's early in his career, and you can see those fantastical creatures that are surrounding Anthony. Sorry, I'm throwing all these names around, but surrounding St. Anthony. Usually they're combos of different lizards and animals, and parts are taken off one and put on the other. But you can see them all tearing at him and trying to tempt him. The second picture is also from a similar depiction of St. Anthony, and this is by a guy named Nicholas Deutsch in 1520. So we're talking about 30, 40 years later, but it's the same concept, these fantastical creatures. And in one case, you can see one has some sort of club or a whip that he's actually using to beat Anthony with. and he's also being pulled by the beard and scratched and being told nasty things. And so it goes on and on and on, these temptations. And you can see why this would be a popular thing to draw in art, because it's such a rich subject. So what else do we know about St. Anthony? We know that, from St. Athanasius, that in addition to these battles, he would actually show up in Alexandria twice. Remember, Alexandria, or that area, is the city of his youth. He would show up once to be martyred. This is before Constantine, probably in the reign of Decius, is what most people think. He actually shows up in the city of Alexandria to be martyred. But he's not martyred because he and his companions are so dirty and filthy. You can imagine this, right? This huge bearded guy wearing this gray or black cloak, all dusty from the desert. Just looks like this old beggar shows up. The Roman governor is basically saying, forget you, why should I waste my time? It's just kind of a funny statement. But Anthony shows up for martyrdom and is rejected, so he goes back to the desert. The second time that he shows up in Alexandria is during the Arian controversy, which was our previous episode, involving those who denied the divinity of the Son, or at least gave him a lesser divinity. And so what Anthony did is he showed up because some of the Arians were claiming that he supported their position. So here comes Anthony, who is not formally theologically trained and probably only spoke Coptic, the local Egyptian language, rather as opposed to the more common languages like Latin and Greek. But he shows up in Alexandria to the surprise of everybody and confounds the Arians. He is absolutely aghast at what he hears about what Arian doctrine is about. So here comes Anthony, the most famous desert father, and rather than helping the Arians, which they thought, he rather shows up and confounds them and confirms the Orthodox faith of the Nicene Council. Now this is, of course, from St. Athanasius' account, who, of course, is very Orthodox. But it's kind of a neat little story because it shows that he took a concern to events. Even though he wanted solitude, he wanted that ability to just contemplate God in silence, he was still willing, when the situation was dire, when the church needed him, to break out of his solitude and address a major issue that was breaking up the church. St. Anthony's brand of monasticism is sometimes known as eremitic or hermitic monasticism. This is as opposed to what is known as cenobitic or communal monasticism. And so Anthony is basically on his own for days at a time without contact with anybody else in the world. And so this sort of solitary idea, this solitary hermitage, is where Anthony comes in. So he's considered a sort of founder, one of the main figures that found this form of monasticism. They are also known as anchorites, especially in the Eastern Church. So if you hear the term anchorite, they are referring to those who are living that singular lifestyle rather than living in a community of fellow monks. Athanasius also spent time with these guys. So when he was exiled, if you remember, because he fought the Arians and refused to compromise to the emperors, he was exiled 5 times. Well, a couple of times when he was exiled, he actually ended up in the desert with his fellow monks. Now, I say fellow, even though Athanasius wasn't a full monk. He tried to live a monastic lifestyle to be above reproach. And so Athanasius actually shows up in the desert and learns from these guys, including St. Anthony. When St. Anthony dies, the only possessions he has are a couple of sheepskins and his cloak. And he sends his cloak to Athanasius, and this cloak, this dirty cloak worn by this great monastic father, this great desert father, becomes Athanasius' most cherished possession. The trials and temptations that are depicted in Western art also become depicted in areas such as music and in the writings of other fathers. St. Augustine, who is a guy we will study, we will spend an entire hour later on, after we've done our general 700 years, we will spend an entire hour on St. Augustine because of his importance to Christendom and to Western philosophy even in general. But his life, that is St. Anthony's life as recorded in his biography by St. Athanasius, is one of the primary books that converted St. Augustine. Now, the book of Romans from the New Testament is the primary book that converts Augustine, but this lifestyle, or the trials and temptations and everything else that St. Athanasius records, are also influential on St. Augustine and converting to the Christian faith. So every figure in monastic history, or at least virtually every figure, is inspired or influenced by Anthony in some way. This would include the famous Saint Benedict. It would also include Pachomius, who we will run into in a little bit here, Jerome, and many others. They are basically looking at Anthony as their sort of spiritual father or their predecessor, their hero for the lifestyle. If you look on your screen, you can see a Greek icon of St. Anthony. And most of you out there are probably unfamiliar with Greek, but you can tell that it's Anthony on the right-hand side. The first three letters look almost the same, right, with the alpha and the nu. So the Antonios is what it kind of looks like. It looks like Antonios, if we were speaking Italian or Greek or something like that. Of course, I'm transliterating a bit. I'm not actually reading all the Greek letters. But you can see that this is indeed St. Anthony holding some of his writings. Of course, with the head covering, meaning he's a monastic. This is a picture of the monastic desert that he was a part of, the Egyptian monastic desert. Looks pretty hospitable, doesn't it? It's rather barren. I don't see a drop of water or a plant or a tree in sight. Rather, it looks very dry, and even though this picture was taken either at sunset or at sunrise, one can imagine that it's also pretty hot during the high point of the day. So that sort of desolate place was the sort of place that Anthony and others like him would go to avoid the hustle and bustle of the city and to live a more authentic Christian life. Next, we need to talk about another figure of the ancient monastic movement, Saint Pachomius. Whereas Anthony is sort of associated as the father of the singular monks, the anchorites, the hermitic monks, Pachomius is the founder of the communal monks, at least traditionally. That doesn't mean that there weren't other communities, but he's given the credit and considered kind of the father because he's so influential. So because, like Anthony, he's native to Egypt, you can see why Egypt again becomes this focus, and it just spreads from there. It's kind of the epicenter, if you want to use the earthquake term. So as a native of Egypt, he's actually drafted into the Roman army. He's a Roman citizen. He's drafted into the army, and he is not happy about it. He thinks it's the worst thing that could have possibly happened to him. He really did not want to join the army, and yet here he is being drafted into it. Was not the high point of his life, needless to say. However, when he is actually in the army, while he's stationed, he's witnessed to and counseled by a Christian, and he is enormously impressed by what the Christian is telling him. The Christian is giving him advice, he's feeding him, he's clothing him, he's telling him jokes, he's doing whatever it is to help Pachomius feel better, but he is also witnessing to Pachomius about the Christian gospel and what the good news is. And so he eventually converts to the faith, he's baptized, and he's instructed or catechized. You'll hear me use that term sometimes as well. Remember, a nation of heretics that we have today, right? Here we have a convert, and he's instructed faithfully, and after he's instructed, he leaves for the desert for 7 years, at first trying to live that hermitic single lifestyle. So his initial idea is to go be like St. Anthony. However, as he's there, his brother eventually would join him, and he has a vision that God himself is telling him that he needs to serve the world. And he himself is probably, just from a psychological standpoint, rather unsatisfied with what is taking place so far. So what he and his brother do is they start creating monastic communities. Rather than being content with just being in a singular, as a singular monk, or just kind of perhaps as brothers being in a sort of mini community, they actually organize the cenobitic or communal form of monasticism, he and his brother to a lesser extent. He also creates a rule. Now, a rule is not necessarily just a singular statement or like a ruler or something like that. What it is it's sort of a monastic constitution, a rule, a way in which people are supposed to follow and live their monastic life. So as they live this monastic life, they need guidelines, what to eat, when to get up, when to pray, how do we react when something like this happens. Eventually, in the medieval church, we have a whole system of law called canon law, based on ancient Roman models, but even here we have these sort of basic practical guidelines for the monks to live and follow. So the rule stipulates that we need constant prayer, that we need to study the scriptures faithfully and diligently at all times, that we need to read the church fathers, those who have gone before us. Yes, even in the late 290s and early 300s, people recognize fathers of the church as important to read, although certainly not the same level as Scripture. The other thing that's emphasized is manual labor and community service. It's to help keep you humble, to work with your hands, and to earn your keep. So rather than locking yourselves in a cell saying, oh, how great am I? I'm a monk, and I'm praying all day, and see how holy I am. No, Pachomius' rule is you need to work. You need to tend the garden. You need to be a baker. You need to be somebody who makes olive oil. You need to go into the community and sell baskets and help the less fortunate. So this sort of community mindset, not only in terms of helping each other out with cooking, but rather even going into the communities themselves, is very, very much tied into Pachomius' idea of the communal life. The diet that they would eat consisted of veggies, fruit, bread, and olive oil. A lot of us probably could do well to eat a similar diet, right? I probably resemble that remark. I could probably use to eat a few more fruits and veggies, olive oil, and bread. But that simple diet and their separation from the basically disease-ridden cities helps them live very, very long amounts in their lives. And so rather than connecting what the latest and greatest disease is out of these festering swamps of cities, and some of them really were festering depending on the time of day and also just the time that we're talking about historically. But these cities were not the greatest places to live from a cleanliness standpoint, from a hygiene standpoint. And so by eating this simple, healthy diet and removing yourself from where most people contracted disease, these monks lived very, very long lives, which of course added to their reputation as holy men. Something is different about them. This rule by Pachomius, by the way, would be translated into Latin by the famous figure of St. Jerome, another guy that we will meet later on in Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers, who has done other work to move things forward for the monks. He himself, Jerome, as a very educated one, also lived the monastic lifestyle outside of Bethlehem as he translated the Holy Scriptures into Latin, the translation that we today know as the Vulgate. There's an icon on your screen of Pachomius receiving the monastic rule and his habit. A habit, by the way, a monastic habit is the way you dress and the accessories that come with the way you dress. So he's receiving his habit, he's receiving his clothes, what he's supposed to wear from the angel in this painting, and he is also receiving the rule, which you see as a scroll in the angel's hand. Pachomius is on the right, in case you weren't clear. I figured the wings in the picture would sort of give it away, but in case you weren't clear, because you might think something weird's going on in the painting, Pachomius is the figure, the simple figure, and that's important, simplicity, the simple figure on the right. These cities included buildings, multiple buildings within an enclosure to make things more convenient and also so they wouldn't have to go out into the world as much. And so you can see, this is from the Nitrian Desert in Egypt, you can see the remains, the outlines of some of the ruins of rooms. Say that one a couple of times fast, right? The ruins of rooms. But you can see these rooms and how they organize themselves and basically, in the words of Athanasius, turn the desert into a city. So in a way, it's kind of ironic because they left the city in order to turn the desert into a city. Now, of course, this city, though, was full of people who were trying to live authentic Christian lives rather than just people who did it because it was politically convenient or popular because the emperor did it. Now that we've established these Eastern fathers and talked about Pachomius and we've talked about Anthony, we actually now need to go to the West and talk about some of the Western fathers of monasticism and some of those figures. Probably the most famous in the West is Martin of Tours, France. So it looks, or Tours if you want to be anglicized here, but Martin of Tours. He's the son of a pagan Roman aristocrat who is probably most likely involved in the military. And so he wants to become a Christian very early on. In fact, he becomes a catechumen. Remember, catechetics meaning instruction, so he's being properly instructed. He actually becomes a catechumen at the age of 10, but because his family is not happy with his decisions, he's actually forced to join the military at the age of 15. That, of course, depresses him. However, he's still trying to live a Christian life, even though he hasn't been baptized and doesn't quite know exactly everything that he believes. Now, the next account is the most famous account surrounding Martin of Tours. So when he's stationed in France, he sees a cold beggar on the side of the road. This is probably in the middle of winter, okay? So in the middle of winter, he sees this cold beggar on the side of the road, and what does he do but tear his cloak and give half of that cloak to the beggar? so that he can stay warm. What happens after this is what really becomes famous, is he has a vision that night, and Christ himself says, "As you have done to the least of these, you have done to me." Other accounts have him actually addressing Martin, or in the third person sort of, saying something like, "Here is Martin, the unbaptized Roman soldier who clothed me." Really kind of a neat story. So this Martin is then baptized. He cuts up his cloak, he gives it to the beggar. People realize that it's going to be hard to say that he's not a Christian anymore, since he's trying to live out the Christian life. And so he's baptized, and then is kicked out of the army because they don't want him being a fly in their ointment. They don't want him in there questioning whether or not their wars are just. And so they actually remove Martin of Tours from the military, which, as you remember, he never wanted to be in the first place. So it was probably an amicable separation from both sides, saying, yeah, I don't really need you and you don't really need me. After he leaves, he becomes a disciple of Saint Hilary of Poitiers. Poitiers and Tours are actually very close to each other. There's a famous battle that's sometimes called the Battle of Tours or the Battle of Poitiers, with Charles Martel, the hammer, defeating the forces of Islam. We'll talk about that battle in a later episode. But Martin of Tours then studies under Hilary of Poitiers, who is often called the Athanasius of the West, because of how effectively and how seriously he took the Orthodox Christian faith and in defeating the heresy of Arianism. After Hilary dies, he actually succeeds Hilary as the bishop, but rather than taking up really fancy clothes or building himself a palace or living large in a cathedral, what he does is he actually lives a monastic life. He becomes so concerned that he not cause people to stumble or create dissension in the church. He knows that he needs to live a more authentic Christian life, and in order to do that, he lives a monastic lifestyle as a bishop. And this becomes a sort of prototype for all bishops to follow. Even though very many would fail, it's still the prototype or the ideal for the bishop, to live a monastic lifestyle. Remember, Paul said that if you're going to be in charge of these things and doing the Lord's work, it's better to be single. Now, if you have a bunch of pastors under your care, or if you're living in a city that has a large flock, you can see why living that monastic lifestyle would keep you above reproach and cause people to respect what you have to say as a pastor and as a bishop. This story of Martin of Tours, especially the part about cutting up his cloak for the beggar, is hugely famous and hugely popular in the West. And so you will see this depicted in art everywhere. Actually, if you look at the background of the slide that you see on your screen right now, you can see a rather happy-looking horse observing as Martin cuts up his cloak and gives it to the beggar. This cloak, by the way, this half cloak, was put in the side aisle of a church. Now, this is just an interesting bit of trivia. It's not like something you have to memorize, but it's interesting to see about how important this story is. So this cloak ends up in the side chapel, and this chapel, or capella, as it would be in Latin and then the Italianate, is actually the Latin word for cloak. So when you enter a chapel within a church or a chapel within a cathedral, when you walk in, you enter that chapel, you are entering, in a sense, the cloak. And it's called that because St. Martin of Tours actually cut up his cloak, and his half ended up in the side chapel, or in this side room, which becomes called a chapel. So just a little bit of trivia there. You can also see on your screen here, in addition to some artwork we've looked at in terms of visual art, both icons and Western art, this is actually a depiction in statuary on the Hochst Cathedral, or the Hochst Dome in Frankfurt, Germany. You could see him again cutting up his cloak, and the naked and cold beggar waiting for that cloak. And of course, Christ is going to show up to him later on in a dream saying, "Here is Martin, the guy who clothed me," right? We also have depictions of Martin in stained glass, and I could spend the rest of the episode, if I wanted to, showing you all the different pictures of Martin being kind to the elderly naked beggar and how Christ appears to him in a dream. Our final monastic figure that we need to talk about before we end today is Saint Benedict. Most people, with the exception of maybe Saint Anthony, but most people know the name Saint Benedict because we have Benedictine monks. We have Benedictine University in northern Illinois. So Benedictines, following the rule of Saint Benedict, are probably the most famous of monks, especially Christian monks. So he's actually the son of a Roman noble, and he goes through a wild child period. He's living it up, so to speak. He's getting drunk. He's having affairs with all these different women. He's just living this really nasty, just almost what you would call hedonistic lifestyle. However, he runs into his classmates who are living something similar, and he is disgusted and repulsed by it. So rather than join on in and just kind of say, I'll just ignore my qualms about this, he decides to live a life dedicated to the Gospels instead. So he leaves Rome for the country. Sound familiar to anybody? Rather than leaving Alexandria for the desert, he's leaving Rome for the country. Similar move away from things. And so he leaves to slow things down, to get away from the hustle and bustle. And while he's there, he spends 3 years alone in a cave on the advice of a hermit that he runs into in order to better prepare for his future ministry. Another interesting parallel in terms of the figure of Paul also is the Apostle Paul most likely spent about 3 years in the desert, and in the desert he probably received revelation from God, hence why he just kind of falls up the nap for a little bit, at least for a couple of years. And so here's another parallel. We have Benedict going and kind of living in a cave, receiving his revelation, if you want to use that term, so he knows what he's supposed to do with his life and for the church. He is most famous, this is St. Benedict, for his rule. So St. Benedict's, the rule of St. Benedict, this is a rule that is still followed to this day, especially during the Middle Ages, but also even to this day, the rule of St. Benedict is still in force. You will find Benedictine monks. One of the reasons the rule is so popular is because of its moderation. It's a type of rule in which people are able to follow it rather than it's some sort of ideal that nobody can attain to. It's very practical, which makes it very appealing and powerful for the people of the West. He also establishes the monastery at Monte Cassino. How many of you out there recognize the Battle of Monte Cassino? This was a major, and I mean major, World War II battle between the Italians and some Germans against the Allied forces in Italy. So the Battle of Monte Cassino, and the reason this is because the Axis powers, the Germans and the Italians, had walled themselves up behind this great monastery that was founded by Benedict, and so the Allies destroyed huge sections of it, and as did the people hiding behind it, of course, as well. And so it needed to be rebuilt. So if you look at your screen, and some of you might actually recognize this picture from the introductions, because I used this picture in the introduction for the show. But if you look at the screen and you look at the domes, you can tell that it's been rebuilt in a sort of Baroque style. But the point being is that it still exists today, the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. He also establishes something known as the divine offices, sometimes also called the hours of the day. So if you look at your screen, these will sound very familiar to you. Things like matins and lauds, prime, tierce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Most of you who come from a liturgical tradition will probably recognize some of these offices. Now, why these are there is it's to organize the prayer life, to be in constant prayer, to set your mind on things above. And so when you wake up in the morning or wake up at midnight just because you need to do matins, and then you wake up at dawn to do lauds, and then you do prime and tierce and sex and so on, and then close the day with compline, you are surrounded from the moment you wake up to the moment you die by prayer and the scriptures, because there's readings in these as well. These hours of the day are still practiced, both in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in places like Lutherans and Anglicans. I myself have led several Vespers and Matin services at the local Lutheran body. So it's something that's actually been maintained even by some Protestant churches. But this is, again, the importance of Benedict. He established these divine offices in his rule, and to this day they are still effective and still used. Now, before I let you guys go, I wanted to give you some resources if you want to know more about monasticism. If you look at your screen, there's a book called The Emergence of Monasticism, From the Desert Fathers to the Early Middle Ages by Marilyn Dunn. The book is rather expensive, but it is well worth your while in terms of reading it. And it really gets into some of the just other factors that might have played a role, like there's the Manichaeans, a kind of a heretical or really just a pagan sect that has similar movements. It might talk about the Roman aspect of things as well, but it goes through the writings of Athanasius about Anthony and Anthony himself and traces things. So The Emergence of Monasticism by Marilyn Dunn. Another book I recommend, which I'm going to hold up for the camera right here, is known as The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. This was actually compiled and translated by Benedict Ward, and I highly recommend it. It goes A to Z, includes some desert mothers, very practical. It's a primary source. You want to know what they thought about themselves, what kind of advice the monks gave, why they did what they did. Why not read the accounts that we have, some of it in their own words or some of it recorded by their students or people that are learning from them. So again, this book, The Sayings of the Desert Fathers by Benedict Ward, and this is the alphabetical collection. There's a non-alphabetical, and I believe it's topical collection, but the alphabetical collection is right here. Highly recommend this as well. So, now that we've established what the monks were doing, living that authentic Christian life, which they would eventually become centers for learning, of course, but being living martyrs, being living witnesses for the faith, we can now focus back a little bit more onto our historical narrative, because these monks will continue to show up again and again and again, and usually when they show up, it's for good reasons. Now, there's a couple reasons why it's not, but as a whole, a monk showing up or taking control always meant renewal for the church. And so read these guys. Read about the monks. Read about Abba Moses. Read about what these people do. In fact, I'm going to leave with a quote here, and this is by Abba Moses. So you can see how practical these ideas are. This comes from an Eastern collection known as the Philokalia. And so I will close with this. Germanos, this is the student, asked, "How does it happen that even against our will, many ideas and wicked thoughts trouble us, entering by stealth and undetected to steal our attention? Not only are we unable to prevent them from entering, but it is extremely difficult to recognize them." And he asks, how do we get rid of these? So Abba Moses, who I didn't have time to talk much about, but he's another early figure, he replies, "It is impossible for the mind not to be troubled by these thoughts. But if we exert ourselves, it is within our power to either accept them and to give them our attention, or to expel them. Their coming is not within our power to control, but their expulsion is. The amending of our mind is also within the power of our choice and effort. When we meditate wisely and continually on the law of God, study psalms and canticles, engage in fasting and vigils, and always bear in mind what is to come, the kingdom of heaven, or the Gehenna of fire," Gehenna is another word that we translate as hell, "our wicked thoughts diminish and find no place." And he goes on to talk about some other situations. So you can see how important this early monastic idea was to the church, and how they were genuinely trying in a practical way to live their faith out with faith and trembling. So again, thank you for watching Martyrs, Kings, and Fathers, and this look at monasticism, and I hope you will join us again next week. Thanks for joining us.